The sun at high noon held no mercy for Dry Willow Crossing. It was a hammer of white gold light, beating down on the single dusty street until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. The wind, a hot, restless thing, did little to help. It only stirred the fine red dust, whirling it into lazy devils that danced in the doorways of the mercantile and the assayer's office before collapsing again into a gritty blanket over everything. The world smelled of baked earth, hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, and the faint, metallic tang of rust from the half-finished railroad tracks that stopped just short of town like a promise left unkept. A line of freight wagons, their canvas tops bleached the color of old bone, had ground to a halt at the edge of town, the teamsters shielding their eyes and cursing under their breath. The cause of the delay was twofold. First came the rhythmic, heavy beat of shod hooves, not the weary plod of ranch horses, but the powerful, arrogant gait of a dozen well-fed mounts ridden by men who were paid to look mean. They moved with the grim efficiency of a wolf pack, flanking a sturdy wagon that carried a single, immense iron safe. Its surface was black, bolted, and seemed to swallow the light around it. Then came the second sound, a sharp, piercing shriek of steam that cut through the midday stupor. It was the new locomotive, the iron beast of the Kincaid Mining Rail Company, testing its lungs on the new spur line. The whistle was a declaration, a sound of progress that felt more like a threat to the quiet, sun-baked rhythms of Dry Willow. From the cool shadow of her workshop's overhang, Tamsin Vale watched it all. Her faded linen shirt was sticking to her back, and her hands, resting on a half-finished saddle draped over a wooden horse, were a map of her trade. The palms were calloused, the fingers strong, with faint scars from errant awls and the permanent stain of leather dye deep in the cuticles. She knew the riders, everyone did. They were Bram Kincaid's men, a collection of hard cases whose loyalty was bought with coin and the license to be cruel. And Kincaid, the man who owned them, the locomotive, and increasingly, the land itself, was a ghost who haunted every conversation in town. The whispers followed him like his own shadow tales of contracts with fine print that could steal a man's birthright, of water rights diverted, of families starved off their homesteads by legal maneuvers as deadly as any bullet. Tamsin's gaze flickered across the street to the saloon. Leaning against a porch post, half hidden in the shade, was Colt Mercer. He was still, a study in quiet observation, his hat pulled low. As the owner of the Silver Gate Ranch, one of the few large spreads Kincaid hadn't yet managed to swallow, he had more reason than most to watch the man's operations. He held a glass of what was probably water, but his posture was anything but relaxed. His stillness was that of a predator, waiting, watching, measuring the world before making a move. His eyes, Tamsin knew, would be missing nothing. The tension in the street was a palpable thing, thick as the dust. Kincaid's men dismounted, their spurs jingling a discordant tune, their hands never straying far from the pistols holstered on their hips. They began the laborious process of unloading the iron safe, their movements clumsy but effective. The town held its breath. The teamsters stayed by their wagons, and shopkeepers peered from behind dusty windows. It was then that the delicate balance of the moment was shattered by the smallest of incidents. A boy, no older than 12, all gangly limbs and earnest haste, came sprinting down the street. He was one of the mail couriers, carrying a worn leather satchel that bounced against his hip. He was trying to cut across the street, his eyes on the far side, not on the chaos unfolding before him. His worn-out boot caught on an exposed root, and he went down hard in a cloud of red dust. The satchel flew from his grasp, arcing through the air and landing with a soft thud, not 10 feet from Tamsin's workshop. Its flap fell open, spilling a handful of letters onto the dirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The boy lay stunned, gasping for breath. Kincaid's men barely gave him a glance, too engrossed in their task. Colt Mercer straightened slightly from his post, his attention drawn to the small disruption. Tamsin acted without thinking. It was the instinct of a neighbor, of someone who understood the fragility of life in a place like this. She moved from the shade into the blinding sun, her boots sinking into the dust. She knelt by the scattered mail, her practical hands quickly gathering the envelopes. "You all right, son?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. The boy, scrambling to his feet and brushing himself off with a mortified expression, just nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." As she handed the bundle back to him, her fingers brushed against one particular envelope. It was thicker than the others, made of heavy, expensive stock, but it wasn't the weight that caught her attention. It was the seal, a dollop of dark red wax. Pressed with an official insignia, she recognized instantly the seal of Rook County, and the addressee, written in a clerk's precise, elegant script, was the Honorable Judge Ezekiel Rowan, Rook County District Court. A jolt went through her. Sharp and electric. Rook County, Judge Rowan. The one man rumored to have the spine to stand up to men like Kincaid. The whispers about the railroad contractor suddenly took on a new, terrifying clarity. Contracts, land grabs, and here, in her hand, was an official-looking document from the county seat, meant for the judge's eyes only. Could this be it? The proof, the ledgers, the deeds, the evidence that could stop Kincaid's relentless consumption of the valley. The thought had barely formed when one of Kincaid's men, a hulking brute with a sun-scorched face and a scar that cut through one eyebrow, turned his attention from the safe. His eyes narrowed, sweeping over the scene with a sudden, predatory focus. "What was that?" "What did you drop, boy?" he barked, his voice like gravel grinding together. The courier boy froze, his eyes wide with fear. Tamsin's mind raced. If they saw that seal, they would take the letter. It would disappear, and whatever hope it contained would be extinguished in the firebox of Kincaid's locomotive. Her movements became a fluid extension of her will. As she stood up, turning to face her workshop, she palmed the Rook County envelope. In a single, seamless motion, she slid it between the layers of leather on the saddle beside her, pushing it deep into the unfinished wool lining where it would be invisible to a casual glance. She did it all while maintaining a look of mild, detached concern. "He just took a tumble, is all," Tamsin said, her tone even. "No harm done." The scarred man wasn't convinced. He strode forward, his boots kicking up puffs of dust. He ignored the boy, his suspicious gaze fixed on Tamsin. "You were mighty quick to help. Let's see your hands." Before Tamsin could react, he shot out a beefy hand and clamped it around her wrist. His grip was like an iron band, crushing and immediate. Pain flared up her arm. "I said, let's see what you're holding," he snarled, his foul breath washing over her. And then, a voice from the saloon porch, quiet, but carrying the weight of command, cut through the tension. "That's enough." Colt Mercer stepped out of the shadows and into the sun. He moved with an unhurried grace that was more menacing than any sudden charge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply walked across the street, his eyes locked on the hand gripping Tamsin's wrist. The scarred man turned, a sneer on his face. "This ain't your concern. Mercer, go back to your drink." "I'm making it my concern," Colt replied, his voice still low, almost conversational. He stopped a few feet away. "Let the lady go." The brief, violent encounter that followed was over almost before it began. It was a blur of contained, efficient force. The henchman, thinking to intimidate Colt, tightened his grip on Tamsin and made a move to shove her aside. It was a fatal miscalculation. Colt closed the distance in a single step. His hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm. He didn't grab the man's wrist. He grabbed his hand, twisting it at an angle that defied the body's natural mechanics. There was a sickening crack of bone and a strangled scream of agony. The henchman's grip on Tamsin vanished. Colt didn't stop there. He used the man's own momentum, spinning him around and sending him stumbling backward into a pyramid of empty supply barrels stacked against the mercantile wall. The structure collapsed with a hollow, echoing crash, and the man went down in a heap of splintered wood and shame. Silence descended on the street, broken only by the whimpering of the injured man. The other members of Kincaid's crew, startled out of their complacency, reacted instantly. Leather rasped as 3 pistols were drawn, the black metal glinting in the harsh sunlight, but they hesitated. Colt hadn't drawn his weapon. He stood calmly in the middle of the street, his hands empty at his sides, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and unflinching. To open fire on an unarmed man in the center of town, with a dozen witnesses, was a line even they were reluctant to cross. It was in that tense, frozen moment that a new sound joined the tableau, the deep, resonant tolling of the church bell at the end of the street. It wasn't the frantic peal of an alarm, but the slow, deliberate summons for an unexpected town meeting or perhaps an early vespers. Heads began to appear in windows. Doors creaked open. The silent witnesses were becoming a crowd, drawn by the confrontation and the official sounding bell, the pressure of public opinion. A force more potent than any single gun began to build. Tamsin moved to Colt's side, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice a steady, urgent whisper against his ear. "I have something," she breathed, not daring to look at the saddle. "Something that belongs to the court. It needs to get to Rook County, before dawn." Colt didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the street, where a new figure had appeared, Bram Kincaid himself, standing on the platform of his locomotive, a silhouette of power against the shimmering engine. He was too far to hear, but even from this distance, they could see the cold, calculating look on his face as he surveyed the scene. Colt gave a barely perceptible nod. Kincaid began to walk toward them, his steps measured, his expensive boots making no sound in the thick dust. He was a man of contrasts, impeccably dressed in a fine city suit, yet perfectly at home in this raw, untamed landscape. He stopped 20 feet away, a thin, chilling smile playing on his lips. "Any piece of land I want," he said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, a promise of inexorable force. The threat hung in the air, settling on the town like another layer of red dust. Tamsin knew they had seconds. The crowd was a temporary shield, but it wouldn't last. Kincaid's smile was the last thing she saw before she made her own move. She put a hand on Colt's arm, her touch firm, pulling him toward the dark, open door of her workshop. "Get inside first," she whispered, the words lost to everyone but him. "I'll lock the door." He looked back at her, a question in his eyes, but he saw the resolve in hers and didn't hesitate. He followed her into the cool, leather-scented darkness of the saddlery. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, plunging the street into a sliver of vision before it closed completely, cutting off the sunlight and the hostile eyes. A solid, definitive click echoed in the small space as Tamsin shot the heavy iron bolt home. Outside, the silence was broken by the impatient, percussive stomping of Kincaid's horses, a sound like the first heavy drops of rain before a storm. The heavy bolt slid home with a sound like a breaking bone, a final, metallic punctuation to the chaos outside. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own breathing, harsh and ragged in the sudden, enveloping silence of the workshop. The air inside was cool, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the street. It carried the rich, earthy scent of tanned leather, the sweet perfume of beeswax, and the sharp tang of steel tools. Shafts of dusty light slanted down from the high, narrow windows, illuminating the ordered world Tamsin had built for herself, racks of cured hides hanging like stiff ghosts, coils of rawhide lacing, benches cluttered with awls, knives, and mallets, and in the center of it all, the half-finished saddles on their wooden horses. Tamsin leaned her back against the door. Her eyes closed for a single, long second. She could feel the vibrations through the thick wood as someone outside pounded a fist against it. She didn't flinch. Her hands, however, were not so steady. They trembled slightly, a testament to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She took a deep, centering breath, pushed herself away from the door, and walked over to the saddle where she had hidden the envelope. Colt watched her, his expression unreadable. He had moved away from the door, positioning himself in the deeper shadows beside a tall rack of tanned cowhides. He wasn't crowding her, giving her the space she needed, but his presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the room. He was a man accustomed to trouble, and it showed in the economy of his movements, in the way his eyes constantly assessed the space, noting the exits, the potential cover, the way the light fell. With practiced fingers that belied her inner turmoil, Tamsin reached into the thick wool lining of the saddle skirt. Her hand closed around the stiff paper of the envelope. She pulled it out, holding it in the dim light. The red wax seal of Rook County seemed to glow with a life of its own, a single drop of blood against the cream-colored paper. Her eyes were fixed on it, her jaw set with a fierce determination that chased the last of the tremor from her hands. "My parents died downriver," she said, her voice low but clear, filling the quiet space. She wasn't looking at him, but at the letter, as if it held the sum of her past. Swamp fever took them both in the same week, left me with nothing but a good name and the clothes on my back. I was 14. She paused, running a thumb over the wax seal. Old Man Hemlock, the saddler in 3 Creeks, took me in. Not out of charity. He needed a strong back and cheap hands to stitch his leather. He taught me the trade. Taught me that you can tell the measure of a man by the quality of his saddle, and the measure of his word by the ink on his contract. Finally, she looked up, and her eyes met Colt's in the dusty light. Hemlock lost his shop to a man with a fast-talking lawyer and a piece of paper he couldn't read properly. He signed his life away without ever knowing it. I swore then and there, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet gaining an edge of tempered steel, that no one would ever sign my fate away for me, and I wouldn't stand by and watch it happen to anyone else. She held out the envelope. It was an offering, an explanation, and a plea, all in one. Colt took it. His hands, unlike hers, were perfectly steady. They were large and calloused from ranch work, but his touch on the paper was surprisingly gentle. He didn't break the seal. He turned it over, studying the insignia, his thumb tracing the raised image of a raven clutching a key. Rook County, he murmured, more to himself than to her. The name confirmed the whispers he'd been hearing for months, the quiet talk among ranchers who'd been squeezed by Kincaid's railroad. They say Judge Rowan is the only one who keeps his own ledgers, that he's been compiling a case file on land and water rights disputes going back 5 years. He looked from the seal to Tamsin. This could be the key to that file. A sudden, authoritative knock rattled the front door, making them both jump. It wasn't the tentative rap of a customer. It was the hard, impatient sound of a pistol butt against wood. "Open up," a voice called out, artificially loud and official. Town watch, routine inspection. Tamsin's eyes flew to Colt's. The town watch in Dry Willow consisted of one old man named Silas, who was half-deaf and spent most of his days asleep on a bench outside the livery. This was Kincaid's man, the one with the scarred face, trying to bluff his way in. Tamsin put a single finger to her lips. Colt gave a short, sharp nod and melted back behind the rack of hides. The leather creaked softly as he settled into position. His right hand came to rest on the worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He didn't draw it. His reluctance was a tangible thing. A gunfight in the confines of the workshop would be brutal, and spilling blood in the middle of town was a messy business with consequences that could last for years. He preferred to let trouble come to him, to meet it on his own terms, out in the open spaces where a man could see what was coming. The knocking came again, louder this time, angrier. "We know you're in there. Vale. Open this door by order of the watch." The lie was thin, and they knew it. They waited in silence, their breaths held tight in their chests. The only sound was the frantic buzzing of a fly trapped against a window pane. Tamsin could hear the muffled sound of men talking outside, their voices low and frustrated. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy tread of their hobnailed boots receded down the boardwalk. For now, they were gone. Tamsin let out a slow, shuddering breath. "They'll be watching the street," she whispered, moving away from the door. "And the alley," Colt added, his voice a low rumble from the shadows. He stepped back into the light, the envelope still in his hand. "We can't stay here. When night falls, they'll stop pretending to be the law." They stood close together in the center of the room, the urgency of their situation drawing them into a tight circle of conspiracy. Their planning was done in hushed, clipped sentences, a rapid exchange of knowledge and instinct. "We have to leave Dry Willow tonight," Colt said, laying the envelope on a workbench. "The only way they won't expect is the hard way." Across the painted mesa, Tamsin finished for him, already seeing the route in her mind's eye. It was a treacherous landscape of canyons and rockfalls, a place most travelers avoided. "We can follow the old sheepherder's trail. It's barely a path, but it's direct. It'll take us to Crow's Mile Wash by midnight." Colt calculated, "If the water's low, we can cross and be on the flatlands. From there, it's a straight ride to Rook County. We can make the courthouse by sunrise." It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was the only one they had. Tamsin took the envelope. She went to a small chest where she kept her most specialized tools and took out a thin steel tube, no thicker than her thumb, and sealed at one end with a soldered cap. She carefully rolled the precious documents, slid them inside, and fitted a second cap over the open end. The tube was heavy, solid, a miniature safe. Then she did what she did best. She took a saddle that was nearly complete, one destined for a wealthy client. With a sharp knife, she sliced open a seam in the thickest part of the cantle, pulling back the leather to reveal the dense wool packing around the wooden saddle tree. She carved out a small cavity, nestled the steel tube inside, and then folded the leather back into place. Her hands became a blur of motion. She threaded a thick, waxed linen cord onto a curved needle. Her stitches were small, tight, and perfect, following the original holes in the leather. In less than 5 minutes, she had sewn the seam shut. She worked a bit of dark wax into the new thread, rubbing it with a polishing bone until it was indistinguishable from the rest of the saddle's stitching. The secret was buried, hidden in plain sight by a master of the craft. As she worked, the light slanting through the windows began to soften, shifting from harsh white to a warmer, golden hue. The relentless heat of the day started to break. Outside, the evening bell began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that signaled the end of the workday. The red dust that had choked the air all day began to settle in the cooling atmosphere, transforming into a soft haze that would help to cloak their escape. Darkness was falling fast. "I'll get the horses," Colt said quietly. He moved toward the back of the workshop, where a heavy door led to a small, enclosed yard and the alley beyond. "My horse is Turnpike. I'll bring your mare. Juniper, too." He slipped out the back, as silent as a cat. Tamsin watched him go, then turned to survey her workshop. Her home, her entire life was contained within these 4 walls. She took a deep breath, then moved to the front of the shop, her hand resting on the heavy bolt of the main door. She wasn't opening it, just checking it, reassuring herself of its strength. She would need to leave from the back, but she would lock the front last, a final act of ownership. Colt returned a few minutes later, leading 2 horses. He had already taken the necessary precautions. The small brass bells on Juniper's harness were gone. He had torn strips from a saddle blanket and wrapped them around the metal stirrups of both saddles, muffling any sound they might make. He was a man who left nothing to chance. He saddled his own horse, Turnpike, a powerful buckskin with intelligent eyes. Then he took the altered saddle from Tamsin and cinched it carefully onto Juniper's back, his movements economical and sure. Everything was ready. Tamsin took one last look around the familiar, comforting space. Then she walked to the back door, a heavy padlock and key in her hand. She secured the door from the outside, the click of the lock loud in the quiet alley. She turned and looked at the building, her sanctuary, now dark and vulnerable. "When we get back," she said, her voice soft but firm. we'll still have a home to open." Colt was standing by the horses, holding their reins. He looked at her, and for a moment that stretched longer than a single heartbeat. The frantic urgency of their escape fell away. He saw not just a stubborn saddlemaker, but a woman of incredible courage, a woman who was risking everything she had built for a principle. He saw the strength in her that came not from muscle, but from an unbreakable will. Just then, the silence of the evening was torn apart by the sharp, metallic shriek of the locomotive's whistle down by the water tower. The sound echoed through the town, a jarring reminder of the power they were running from. "Kincaid's loading his ore cars," Colt said, his voice pulling them back to the present. "He does it at night. Most of his men will be down at the rail spur. The back streets will be quiet." It was the opening they needed. The monster itself was providing them with cover. Tamsin gave a final, decisive nod. They mounted up. In the deepening twilight, they were just two figures, indistinguishable from any other riders, but they moved with a purpose that was anything but ordinary. They walked the horses slowly down the alley, the cloth-wrapped stirrups making no sound, the horses' hooves muffled by the thick dust. They moved like ghosts, melting into the shadows that clung to the backs of the buildings. As they cleared the last of the town's structures, a sliver of a moon, sharp-edged and white as bone, rose over the dark silhouette of the distant mesas. It cast long, distorted shadows across the desert floor, under its cold, watchful eye. Tamsin Vale and Colt Mercer spurred their horses into a silent gallop, leaving Dry Willow Crossing and its web of lies behind them, two fleeting shadows racing against the dawn. The wind found them as soon as they cleared the last, shallow creek bed outside of town. It was not the lazy, dust-stirring breeze of Dry Willow. This was a different entity altogether, a solid, unseen force pouring down from the high, dark expanse of the Mesa Grande. It was a cold wind, carrying the sharp, clean scent of bruised sagebrush and the faint, electric bite of distant lightning. It tore at Tamsin's linen shirt and whipped Juniper's mane across her eyes. They rode hunched against it, following the faint indentation of a path that was more memory than trail. They were climbing, moving away from the flat, open basin, and onto the first of the great stone ledges that formed the mesa's feet. This was the landscape Tamsin knew, the one she had learned as a girl. She took the lead, her eyes scanning the rock face in the pale moonlight, searching for the markers. They were faint, just small, deliberate nicks in the sandstone, or an unnaturally balanced pile of 3 flat stones, the forgotten language of the sheep-herders who had come before. Colt followed a few paces behind, his trust in her absolute. He rode turnpike with a light hand, letting the powerful buckskin find its own footing on the treacherous, narrow path. The ledge was barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer wall of granite rising on their left and a dizzying 300-foot drop into a dark canyon on their right. Below, in the canyon's basin, Tamsin could see the sickly pale green of a marshland, a place that looked soft and inviting but was, in reality, a sinkhole of grasping mud that could swallow a horse and rider whole. They moved in a strained, tense silence, the only sounds the scrape of iron horseshoes on rock and the relentless, high-pitched whistle of the wind in their ears. They had been riding for nearly 2 hours, pushing the horses as fast as they dared. When Tamsin saw the flicker of light far below, she reined Juniper in so sharply the mare tossed her head in protest. Tamsin's hand went up, a silent signal. Colt was beside her in an instant, his body shielding her from the open expanse. He had seen it too. Down in the basin, moving along the edge of the marshland, was a line of riders. They were carrying torches, the pinpricks of fire, at least a dozen of them, bobbed and weaved in the darkness like a scattering of fiery eyes. Kincaid's men, they must have fanned out, guessing the possible routes out of town. The trackers had found their trail. They're moving fast. Colt's voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the wind. But they're on the canyon floor. They can't see us up here unless we silhouette ourselves. They'll follow the canyon to the Crow's Mile Wash, Tamsin whispered. her mind racing. It's the only way through. They'll be there before us if we stay on this path. Then we don't stay on this path. He pointed upward. Tamsin followed his gaze. A narrower, steeper fissure cut into the rock face above them. It was less a trail and more a scar, a place where water had once rushed, leaving a broken staircase of stone. It's a shortcut. Tamsin breathed. The sheepherders used it to get the flocks to high pasture. It's dangerous. Loose shale. It's our only chance, Colt said. It wasn't a question. Tamsin nodded, nudging Juniper toward the incline. The mare balked, her ears flat against her head as she sensed the danger. Tamsin leaned forward, whispering to the horse, her voice a thread of calm in the wailing wind. She dismounted. We'll have to lead them. Colt was off his horse in a second. He took Turnpike's reins, and Tamsin took Juniper's. The climb was a nightmare. The rocks were sharp, and the loose shale skittered under their boots, sending small cascades of gravel rattling down into the darkness. Every sound was a betrayal, an advertisement of their location to the men below. They were halfway up the fissure when it happened. Tamsin, reaching for a handhold, put her weight on a slab of rock that looked secure. It wasn't. The stone tilted, then slid from under her boot with a sickening scrape. She stumbled, a sharp, involuntary gasp torn from her throat. Her other foot slipped, and she fell backward, her hands grasping at empty air. Juniper whinnied, a high, panicked sound, and scrambled backward, pulling the reins from Tamsin's grasp. In that heart-stopping second, Tamsin saw not the dark canyon floor, but the ground rushing up to meet her. But she didn't fall. An arm like an iron bar snapped around her waist, arresting her momentum with a jolt that knocked the wind from her. Colt had lunged, dropping Turnpike's reins and grabbing her, pulling her back from the precipice. He didn't just stop her fall. He used his own body as an anchor, spinning them both into a deep black crevice in the rock face, a narrow fissure hidden from the trail. They landed hard against the unyielding stone, a tangle of limbs. Above them, Juniper, her eyes wide with terror, had managed to brace herself. Turnpike, ever calm, simply stood his ground, his head low. For a long moment, there was no sound but the frantic, desperate hammering of two hearts pounding against the stone wall and the high, thin scream of the wind, which had mercifully swallowed the sound of the horse's whinny. Tamsin was pressed against Colt, her face buried in the rough wool of his jacket. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart under her cheek, a counter-rhythm to her own frantic pulse. "Are you all right?" he finally got out, his voice rough. She couldn't speak, only nod. Her hands clenched into fists against his chest. He didn't let go, not for a long second, his arm a secure, solid presence around her. Then, gently, he released his grip, and the cold of the night rushed back in. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know a place," he said, "just ahead, a hollow in the rock. We can rest the horses and ourselves. We're hidden from the trail here." He was right. The crevice they had fallen into was the start of a narrow, tunnel-like passage. Colt retrieved Turnpike's reins and calmed Juniper with a low, soothing word. They led the horses deeper into the darkness. After 20 yards, the passage opened into a small, shallow cave, a hollowed-out notch in the mountain that was invisible from below and shielded from the wind. It was what the old-timers called a windbreak. The outline called it Blue Lantern Notch. It was blessedly still. Colt settled the horses, loosening their cinches and giving them a small ration of oats from his saddlebag. Tamsin, her legs still trembling, sank onto a flat rock. They couldn't risk a real fire. Not with the posse so close. But Colt was prepared. He took a small, flat tin from his bag, filled with dried buffalo chips. They were smokeless and would provide a small, concentrated core of heat. He struck a match, and a low blue-white heart of a flame bloomed in the darkness, casting just enough light to chase the deepest shadows from their small sanctuary. The dim light illuminated Tamsin's hands. She flexed her fingers, wincing, and only then did she realize the cost of her hasty work in the shop. She stripped off her leather work gloves. The palms were raw, where she had frantically sewn the steel tube into the saddle. Pulling the thick, waxed thread with all her strength, the rough cord had sliced through her gloves and into her skin. The leather was dark with blood, and the raw, angry abrasions on her palms and fingers wept in the cold air. Colt saw it at the same time. He hissed a low breath through his teeth and crossed to her in 2 strides. "By God." "Tamsin," he murmured, kneeling in front of her. He didn't ask what happened. He understood. This was a wound taken not from a fight, but from the act of preservation. Before she could protest, he was pulling his canteen and a small silver flask from his jacket. "This'll sting," he warned. He uncorked the flask and poured a small amount of clear whiskey over her open wounds. Tamsin cried out, a sharp, choked sound, as the alcohol seared her raw skin. But she didn't pull away. She grit her teeth, her whole body rigid, as he meticulously cleaned the gravel and grit from her hands. His touch was firm, professional. He tore a long, clean strip of white cloth from a spare shirt in his saddlebag. His own hands, she noted, were large and rough-knuckled, scarred from years of ranch work and a life lived outdoors. But his movements as he bandaged her were incredibly gentle. He wrapped each palm carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, his hands lingered for a moment, covering hers. The warmth of his skin soaked into her. She looked up from his work, and her gaze met his. The world shrank to the small, fire-lit space. The wind, the posse, the danger it all receded, replaced by the simple, profound reality of his eyes. She saw in them not pity, but a deep, resonant respect. He saw. She realized. Not a woman in need of rescue, but an equal who had paid a price. It was a raw, unguarded acknowledgement that passed between them without a single word. For the space of a dozen heartbeats, they just looked, 2 self-reliant souls suddenly finding a common anchor in the storm. Then, as if moved by the same unseen string, they both looked away at the exact same instant. A faint, dull flush crept up Tamsin's neck. Colt cleared his throat unnecessarily and stood up, turning his attention to the fire. "That's the first of it. Then," he said, his voice a little gruff. Just as he spoke, a brilliant, silent flash of white light illuminated the entire cave, stark as daylight, throwing their shadows sharp and black against the stone. It was followed a few seconds later by a low, distant rumble that vibrated through the rock itself. The wind at the mouth of the cave shifted, and with it came a new smell, heavier than the sagebrush, the unmistakable, earthy scent of ozone and coming rain. "Rain," Tamsin said, the word a mix of hope and dread. Colt shook his head, already pulling a folded piece of oiled paper from his inner vest pocket. He spread it on the rock, a crude map drawn in charcoal. "That rain will make mud. They'll read our tracks from a mile off. Clear as a printed page. We can't go back to the ridge." He stabbed a finger at a section of the map. "Here, Ghost Timber Cut. It's an old rock slide, a fissure that cuts straight through the next ridge instead of going around. It's unstable. They say the rocks shift in a high wind, but it'll shave half the night off our ride and put us on the far side of the wash before those trackers even know we're gone." Tamsin looked at the map, then at her newly bandaged hands, then back at him. She met his gaze squarely, the last of her trembling gone, replaced by a cold resolve. "We weren't born to take the easy way." "Mr. Mercer," she said. A faint, appreciative smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Colt," he said. "Colt," she agreed, as if to punctuate their decision. A sound split the night. Rising above the wind, it was a long, mournful howl. Chillingly close, a wolf, Juniper, her nerves already frayed, reared back, her shod hooves striking sparks on the stone floor. The sound was dangerously loud in the quiet of the night. Tamsin grabbed for her, but Colt was faster. He didn't fight the mare. He moved with her, one hand on her neck, his voice a low, soothing murmur that was almost hypnotic. "Easy, girl. Easy now," he whispered, stroking her muzzle. "Just a friend singing to the moon. Nothing for us. You're safe." He spoke to the horse as if it were an old friend, his voice a balm on its panic. The mare gradually settled, her ears still flicking, but her body relaxed under his steady hand. Colt gave the horse one last pat and then moved to douse the small fire, grinding the last ember into dust under his boot. He nodded at Tamsin. It's time. They led the horses out of the notch. The wind hit them with the force of a physical blow, and with it, the first stinging, icy drops of rain. They mounted up, pulling their hats low. The world was a vast expanse of shifting, moon-washed darkness, a hostile kingdom of rock and shadow. They moved on. 2 riders and 2 horses. Their silhouettes cast long and stark against the stone by the flickering, intermittent lightning. They moved as one, their shared purpose stretching out before them in the dark like an unspoken, unbreakable oath. The ghost timber cut was a passage through a world of shattered rock and skeletal, long-dead trees. The rain, which had begun as a mere whisper of relief, had turned into a driving, relentless force, slicking the stones and turning the narrow path into a treacherous waterway. They rode with their heads bowed, the water dripping from the brims of their hats, the world reduced to the few feet of treacherous ground illuminated by the next flash of lightning. It was a place that felt hostile to life, a passage not meant for mortal travelers, but they pushed on, driven by a purpose that was stronger than their fear. They emerged from the cut, just as the first hint of gray began to dilute the oppressive black of the night sky. Below them lay a wide, shallow river, its surface churning with brown, rain-fed water. On the far side, the land was flatter, gentler, dotted with the dark shapes of cottonwood trees, and nestled in a bend of the river, a single, flickering lantern burned, a tiny beacon of civilization in the vast wilderness. "Waypost Ferry," Colt said, his voice raw from the cold. "If we can get across, we're on the main track to Rook County." The ferry was little more than a crude wooden platform attached to a thick, greasy rope that stretched across the river. The ferryman's shack was a slumped, tired-looking structure of driftwood and sod. As they approached, the door creaked open and an old man emerged, holding the lantern high. He was stooped, his face a road map of wrinkles, his beard a tangle of white and gray. "You're out late, or damn early," he croaked, his voice like the scrape of a shovel on stone. He squinted at them, his eyes pale and watery in the lantern light. Rivers running high, dangerous crossing. Tamsin slid from Juniper's back, her muscles screaming in protest. She recognized the old man. Marlowe Quist. The ferryman's eyes narrowed further. He raised the lantern, the light falling on her face, a flicker of recognition. Then sorrow passed through his expression. Tamsin Vale. "Hemlock's girl. I heard you set up your own shop in Dry Willow. Heard you were doing well." "Well enough." "Marlowe," Tamsin said gently. "This ain't the road for a woman doing well," he said, his gaze shifting to Colt, who had dismounted and now stood beside his horse, a tall, silent shadow, not with Kincaid's men swarming all over this county like flies on a corpse. "We've had some trouble," Colt admitted, his voice low and even. Marlowe Quist let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a hacking cough. "Trouble," he wheezed, spitting into the mud. "Son, you don't know the meaning of the word until you've signed a piece of paper for one of Kincaid's lawyers." He gestured with a gnarled hand at the ferry landing, at the muddy bank where a proper dock should have been. "This landing, this whole bend in the river, used to be mine, free and clear. Kincaid's railroad needed a temporary right-of-way. Promised me a fair price. Stock in the new line. All I had to do was sign." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, bitter whisper. The contract was thick as a Bible, full of fancy words, but the real poison was in a little line, a single sentence they called the place name substitution clause. "Sounds harmless, don't it?" Tamsin and Colt exchanged a look. "What did it do?" Tamsin asked. "It gave the railroad the right to amend the official survey maps for their own technical documents." Marlowe hissed, his eyes burning with the memory of his own folly. "And that's what they did, on my deed. This here is called Quist's Bend, on their map. the one attached to the contract I signed. They called it Auxiliary Drainage Basin Number 4. The river became a utility corridor, my land. He swept a trembling hand around him. My home became an industrial easement, and I signed it over to them for pennies, all legal and proper. A sudden, blinding understanding washed over Tamsin. It was a theft so audacious, so diabolical in its simplicity, that it was almost brilliant. It wasn't about strong-arming or threats. It was about the manipulation of words, the twisting of maps, until reality itself was redrawn to suit Kincaid's greed. The architecture of his avarice was built not with bricks and mortar, but with ink and paper. Her hand instinctively went to the saddle on Juniper's back, where the steel tube was hidden. It wasn't just a letter. It wasn't just a judge's correspondence. The weight of it suddenly felt immense. "The envelope," she said, looking at Colt, her eyes wide. "It must be the original survey maps, the ones from the county clerk's office, and maybe a ledger, a list of payments to the surveyors who altered them." Colt's face was a grim mask, his jaw tight. He looked out at the churning river, but Tamsin knew he was seeing something else entirely. "My brother, Levi," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He had a small ranch up in the North Range, good land, well watered. Kincaid wanted to run a spur line through it. Levi wouldn't sell. He paused, the silence stretching out, filled only by the rush of the river and the drumming of the rain. A month later, Levi got a bill, a road toll tax. Said he owed for the use of a new access road the railroad had built. A road he never used. A road that wasn't even on his land, but a circuit judge, a man who always drank Kincaid's whiskey, said the debt was legal. They put a lien on Levi's ranch, wiped him out. He lost everything, drank himself into an early grave a year later. Colt finally turned from the river, and the look in his eyes was one of a cold, banked fire. They gave him a piece of paper that was as good as a signature on a gallows warrant. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about revenge. For Marlowe Quist, for Levi Mercer, for Old Man Hemlock. For every man and woman who had been tricked, cheated, and broken by the silent, creeping violence of Kincaid's pen. "We can't just give this to the judge," Tamsin said, her voice filled with a new, hard conviction. "Not in private. Kincaid has men on his payroll everywhere. The sheriff in Rook County, maybe even the clerks. This evidence could be buried, lost, burned in a courthouse fire. It has to be seen." Colt nodded, his mind already working. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow's the Rook County Fair Day. The whole county will be there. The farmers, the ranchers, the merchants. They hold an auction on the courthouse steps, a public hearing." Tamsin finished, a spark of fierce light in her eyes. "We don't just deliver the proof, we deliver it to the people." It was a reckless, audacious plan, born of desperation and fueled by a shared, righteous anger. They were no longer just messengers. They were about to become accusers. Marlowe Quist had been listening, his head cocked. A strange, new light had entered his pale eyes, a glimmer of the man he must have been before Kincaid had broken him. "Fair Day," he rasped. "Aye, that'd be a spectacle." He pointed a shaky finger downriver. "If you're going to do that, you can't take this ferry. Kincaid's got a toll bridge set up a mile from here, on the main road. His men are watching it. They'll be expecting you." He then pointed in the opposite direction, toward a dense thicket of trees. "But there's another way. Sparrow Span. It's an old deer run, a shallow part of the river where the bedrock comes up near the surface. The crossing's rough, but it'll put you in the woods on the other side, well clear of the bridge and the road. You can follow the timberline all the way to Rook County." The seed of a new plan began to form, a plan of deception and misdirection. They had a few hours until the sun was fully up. They needed to rest, but more importantly, they needed to change. They took shelter in Marlowe's shack, a cramped, one-room hovel that smelled of river mud, wood smoke, and old regrets. While the horses were fed and watered, Tamsin and Colt transformed themselves. Tamsin unbraided her hair, letting it fall loose and slightly wild around her shoulders. She smudged a bit of soot from Marlowe's fireplace under her eyes, adding years and a weary hardship to her face. Colt used a length of dark cloth Marlowe gave him as a sling for his arm, and wrapped a second, thicker scarf around his neck and lower face. It served a dual purpose. It hid his clean-shaven jaw and sharp features, but it also concealed a long, jagged scar that ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a memento from a time and a war he never spoke of. Their most important preparation was one of precaution. Tamsin retrieved the steel tube. In the flickering lantern light, she took a piece of charcoal from Marlowe's hearth and a spare sheet of wrapping paper. With quick, deft strokes, she made a rough but convincing copy of the Rook County seal and the judge's address on a second, empty envelope. Then she did the same with a few blank sheets of paper, scribbling lines and figures that, at a glance, might pass for a legal document. She placed this decoy into the empty envelope. "If they catch us, they'll search the saddlebags first," she whispered to Colt, then the saddles. She took the real steel tube, the one with the original documents, and went not to her own mare, Juniper, but to Colt's powerful buckskin, Turnpike. She found a spot under the fender, a place no one would think to look, and used a leather thong to lash it securely to the saddle tree itself, deep within the complex structure of the saddle. The decoy, however, she handled differently. She took out her needle and thread again. She folded the forged envelope and the blank papers inside it and carefully, with her bandaged hands protesting at every stitch, sewed the packet into the thick, wool-lined hem of her own riding coat. It created a slight, barely noticeable stiffness, a decoy, a bluff, a chance. As the rain finally eased, they thanked Marlowe. The old man simply nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You give him hell. Girl," he whispered to Tamsin, "for Hemlock, for all of us." They rode out, not as fugitives, but as a tired, downtrodden husband and wife. A pair of drifters hauling a few pathetic-looking tanned hides that Marlowe had given them, heading to the fair to try and trade for supplies. They moved slowly, their shoulders slumped, the very picture of defeat. They reached the checkpoint at the toll bridge just as the sun broke through the clouds. It was a crude wooden gate, manned by 4 of Kincaid's men. They looked bored, hungover, and irritable. One of them, a man with a heavy gut and a face like a disgruntled bulldog, stepped forward to block their path. "That'll be $2 to cross." He grunted, eyeing them with open contempt. $2. Tamsin cried, her voice a shrill, complaining whine that was utterly unlike her own. "That's robbery. For this rickety piece of junk, we're just simple folk trying to get to the fair to sell our hides. We haven't got $2 to our name." She launched into a long, rambling tirade about the cost of feed, the poor quality of the hides, the sickness of her imaginary mother-in-law. Her performance was masterful. She was annoying, pathetic, and most importantly, distracting. The guards focused on her, their expressions a mixture of amusement and irritation. While Tamsin held their attention, Colt, feigning weariness, had dismounted to adjust his cinch. He moved to the far side of his horse, placing himself out of the guard's direct line of sight. His body was shielded by Turnpike's bulk. In his hand, he held a small, wickedly sharp hide-scraper's knife. His movements were invisible, silent. He found the thick hemp rope that held the crossbeam of the gate in place. Stretched taut against a heavy wooden peg, he didn't try to untie it. He began to saw at it, the small blade biting into the wet, swollen fibers. "Look, lady, either you pay or you turn back," the lead guard was saying. His patience gone. "We ain't got all day." Just as he spoke, the heavens opened again. It wasn't a gentle rain this time, but a sudden, violent downpour, a torrential cloudburst that hit with the force of a collapsing dam. The world dissolved into a roaring, silver-gray sheet of water. In that exact instant, under the cover of the sudden, deafening roar, the rope in Colt's hand parted with a soft thwump. The heavy wooden gate, released from its tension, crashed to the ground with a loud, splintering crack. But the sound was completely swallowed by the thunder of the rain. Now Colt yelled. He vaulted back into his saddle. Tamsin didn't need to be told twice. She kicked Juniper hard, the mare leaping forward. They charged through the opening, their horses' hooves churning the road into a slurry of mud and water. The guards, blinded by the rain and stunned by the sudden turn of events, were left standing in the deluge, shouting uselessly after them, a quarter-mile away, on a high ridge overlooking the road. Bram Kincaid lowered his spyglass. He had watched the entire scene unfold. He had seen the woman's distraction, the man's furtive movements, the final, desperate charge. A cold, knowing smile touched his lips. He hadn't been fooled by the disguise. He knew who they were, and he knew they had something of his, but he also knew he had lost them. For now. He turned to the scarred man, the one whose hand Colt had broken back in Dry Willow. "They slipped the trap," Kincaid said, his voice calm, almost serene. "No matter. They have to come to ground sometime." He folded his spyglass with a soft click. "Ride back to Dry Willow. Send a message to my foreman at the rail spur." He paused, looking back in the direction of the town, his eyes cold and empty. "Tell him to burn the saddlery. Burn it to the ground. Let's see how brave Miss Vale is when she has nothing left to come home to." Behind Tamsin and Colt, as they raced toward Rook County, a new column of smoke would soon begin to rise against the bruised, rain-washed sky, a soot-black promise of a debt that would be paid in fire. They rode through the silver curtain of the downpour for what felt like an eternity. The world dissolved into a churning chaos of water and mud. The forest offered some meager protection, the thick canopy of the cottonwoods breaking the force of the rain, but they were still soaked to the bone, a deep, penetrating cold settling into their muscles. Tamsin was shivering, not from fear, but from the raw, physical shock of the chill. Colt spotted it first, a dark, angular shape through the trees, a place where the straight lines of man-made structure interrupted the wild tangle of nature. It was an old, abandoned watermill, its great wheels silent and rotting, its stone walls covered in a thick blanket of moss, a long, covered porch, its roofline sagging but mostly intact, offered a promise of shelter. In there, he shouted over the roar of the rain, pointing, "We can wait out the worst of it." He led the way, guiding the horses under the relative dry of the porch roof. They dismounted, their boots landing with a squelch in the accumulated mulch of damp, fallen leaves. The air under the overhang was thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting wood, and something else, the faint, mineral scent of old stone. Tamsin leaned against a support post, her arms wrapped around herself, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the past day had finally leached away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and the bone-deep cold. Colt worked quickly, his movements efficient and purposeful. He unsaddled the horses, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry leaves from a protected corner of the porch, his voice a low murmur of reassurance. He then turned his attention to Tamsin. He looked at her, huddled and shivering, and a different kind of urgency entered his actions. He found a dry spot against the mill's stone wall, a small alcove where the wind couldn't reach. He gathered a pile of dry tinder from the underside of a fallen log and, with a few deft strikes of a flint and steel, coaxed a tiny, fragile spark into a small, steady flame. The fire was no bigger than his two hands put together, but its warmth was a miracle. It pushed back the damp chill, its golden light dancing on the weathered stone. He hung their wet outer coats on a nearby peg, where the rising heat could begin its work. Tamsin moved toward the fire, drawn to its heat like a moth to a candle. She held her bandaged, aching hands out to the flames, feeling the life slowly seep back into her numb fingers. Colt watched her for a moment, then went to his saddlebag. He rummaged inside and pulled out a thick gray wool sweater. It was old, the elbows worn thin, but it was clean and dry. He didn't say a word. He just stepped behind her and gently draped it over her shoulders. Tamsin flinched at the unexpected touch, but then the heavy warmth of the wool settled over her. She pulled it closer, burying her face in the collar, It smelled of him, not of sweat or the trail, but of something clean and elemental. Pine smoke from 100 campfires, the dry scent of sun-baked leather, a faint, comforting trace of old sunshine. The simple, honest smell of it calmed her shivering, soothing a part of her she hadn't even realized was so frayed. She slipped her arms into the sleeves, the sweater ridiculously large on her, but it felt like a suit of armor, a shield against the cold and the dark. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice muffled by the wool. He simply nodded and sat down on a smooth, flat stone near the fire, leaving a respectable distance between them. He took out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth from his bag. Inside was a loaf of dense, yellow cornbread. He broke it in half, the steam rising from its center, and handed a piece to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of warmth through Tamsin that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time they had touched without the desperate urgency of a fall, or a fight, or an escape. It was a simple, human connection. She looked up at him, and for the first time since this frantic chase began, she smiled. It wasn't a wide grin, not even a true parting of her lips. It was a smile that lived entirely in her eyes, a sudden softening, a flicker of light in their green depths that spoke of gratitude and a dawning, fragile trust. Colt saw it, and something in his own stern expression eased. He had seen her be defiant, courageous, and terrified, but he had not seen this quiet light in her before. It changed the landscape of her face, making her look younger, less burdened. They ate in a companionable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the old tin roof. The sound was no longer a threat. It was a curtain, enclosing them in their small, temporary sanctuary, shutting out the rest of the hostile world. Colt's gaze fell to her hands. The clean white bandages he had applied in the cave were now damp and stained with grime from their journey. He frowned. "Let me see," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Tamsin hesitated for a moment, then held out her hands. He moved from his stone to kneel in front of her again, just as he had in the cave, with infinite care. He began to unwrap the soiled cloth. Her skin was red and inflamed, the cut still raw. He took out his flask again, but this time, he didn't pour the stinging alcohol directly onto the wounds. He poured a little onto a clean corner of the bandage and used it to gently dab away the dirt. When her hands were clean, he simply held them in his own for a moment. He looked at the angry red lines, then raised her palms closer to his mouth. He blew on them, a soft, steady stream of warm air, a child's remedy for a sting. The gesture was so unexpected, so profoundly gentle, it made Tamsin's breath catch in her throat. It was an act of pure, unadorned kindness, a wordless apology for the pain she had endured. It spoke more than 1,000 finely crafted speeches ever could. He then took 2 long, soft strips of tanned deerskin from a pouch on his belt. He wrapped her hands again with the last of the clean cloth, and then, over the top, he secured the bandages with the soft leather ties, his fingers moving with a surprising dexterity. The deerskin was supple and warm against her skin, a far kinder binding than the rough linen cord that had caused the wounds in the first place. When he finished, he didn't immediately let go. He kept her hands cradled in his. The rain on the roof had become a soft, lulling music. The world outside, with Kincaid and his men, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Tamsin, acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, swayed slightly and rested her head against his shoulder. The wool of his jacket was rough against her cheek. The contact was electric, and for a second, it felt too intimate, too vulnerable. She pulled back, her heart suddenly beating faster. But the space she had just vacated felt instantly, achingly empty. The cold rushed back in. She looked at him. His face was unreadable in the firelight, but he didn't move. He simply waited. He was giving her the choice. And in that quiet, rain-soaked moment, Tamsin made one, slowly, deliberately. She leaned back in, resting her head once more against the solid warmth of his shoulder. This time, it felt right. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never known. He let out a slow breath, a sigh of his own. After a long moment, he tentatively lifted his hand, moving it toward her head. Her hair was still damp from the rain, clinging to her neck and temples in dark, tangled strands. His hand hovered there, just above her hair, a silent question. He was waiting for her consent, for a signal that this, too, was welcome. Tamsin closed her eyes and gave the smallest of nods, a barely perceptible movement. His fingers gently threaded into her damp hair, his touch impossibly soft. He cradled the back of her head, his thumb stroking the delicate skin behind her ear. He drew her closer, and she went willingly, turning her face up toward his. They stayed that way for a long time, simply breathing each other in, their foreheads almost touching. It was an embrace that was more about safety than passion, an acknowledgement of the trust that had been forged in the crucible of their shared danger. The kiss, when it came, was as natural and inevitable as the rain. It was not a kiss of sudden, fiery passion, but one of quiet discovery. His lips were gentle against hers, a soft, questioning pressure. It was a promise, a reassurance. She responded in kind, a silent answer that spoke of acceptance and a shared longing for comfort. The kiss deepened then, but it never lost its essential gentleness. It was a slow, warm exploration, a conversation without words. There was no haste, no frantic grasping. There was only the soft sound of their breathing, the steady beat of the rain on the roof, and the miraculous, quiet thunder of two hearts, which had been racing for different reasons all day, finally finding the same steady, reassuring rhythm. The camera of the mind would have pulled back then, leaving them in the warm, golden light of the fire, the image fading to a close-up of their hands, which had found each other and were now tightly, inextricably clasped. They didn't sleep. They sat by the fire as the hours passed, talking in low voices as the rain slowly softened to a drizzle and then stopped altogether. They didn't talk about Kincaid, or the chase, or the danger that still lay ahead. They talked about the things that mattered. He told her about his ranch, Silver Gate, about the satisfaction of watching a foal take its first steps, about the particular way the light hit the mountains at sunset. She told him about the smell of new leather, about the deep, quiet joy of taking a raw, stiff hide and turning it into something beautiful and useful, something that would carry a person through their life. As the first, pale, watery light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they fell silent again, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. "A house needs a good, strong door," Tamsin said suddenly, her voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. "But it should have a lock that can be opened just as easily from the inside as it can be barred from the outside." Colt looked at her, understanding her meaning perfectly. She was talking about her workshop, about the bolt she had thrown, but she was also talking about something more. About walls, and trust, and letting someone in. It should, he agreed, his voice a low murmur. She took a deep breath. "When this is over," she began, her gaze fixed on the glowing coals. "If you still want, we could make a new sign, for a new shop, somewhere the air is clean." She hesitated for a heartbeat. It could say Val Mercer. The offer hung in the air between them, more vulnerable and more precious than any legal document. It was a proposal for a future, a partnership forged not in ink, but in fire and rain and shared trust. Colt turned his head and looked at her fully. The new light of morning caught in his eyes, chasing the last of the shadows away. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Want," he said. The single word was a vow, a foundation stone laid for a future they had only just begun to imagine. The reflection of the dying embers flared in both their sets of eyes, a shared flame. They sat for a long moment, the unspoken promise settling comfortably between them. Then, with a shared, reluctant sigh, they knew it was time. the world, and the dangers it held, was waiting. Colt doused the last of the embers with water from his canteen. They saddled the horses, their movements synchronized and efficient in the cool, clean-washed air of the new day. They rode out from under the shelter of the old mill, leaving behind the ghost of a fire and the quiet, profound intimacy of a night that had ripened from a desperate flight into a tender, hopeful beginning. Rook County on Fair Day was a different world. It was a chaotic, joyful explosion of life that overflowed the town square and spilled into the side streets. The air, usually thick with dust and the slow pace of rural life, was now a rich tapestry of smells, the sweet, cinnamon-laced perfume of fresh-baked apple pies from the church ladies' stall, the earthy aroma of prize-winning livestock from the pens behind the livery, the sharp, clean scent of sawdust under the auctioneer's block. The sound was a symphony of competing noises, the fast, rhythmic patter of the auctioneer selling off farm implements, the high, sweet strains of a fiddle from the saloon porch, the laughter of children chasing a stray dog, and the low, steady hum of 100 conversations as neighbors who hadn't seen each other since the last harvest caught up on a year's worth of gossip and news. To Tamsin and Colt, the festive atmosphere was a cloak. They moved through the throng not as participants, but as predators, their eyes constantly scanning, their purpose a hard, cold stone in the pit of their stomachs. They had traded their trail-worn clothes for cleaner, more anonymous attire borrowed from Marlowe Quist's sparse wardrobe. They were just another couple, lost in the crowd, their faces grim and focused, a stark contrast to the easy smiles around them. They threaded their way past a stall selling colorful quilts, sidestepped a group of farmers arguing loudly about the price of corn, and ignored the enticing smell of roasting pork. Their destination was the one building that seemed immune to the day's frivolity, the Rook County Courthouse. It stood at the head of the square, a 2-story brick building, solid and imposing. A wide set of wooden steps led up to a pair of heavy oak doors. Today, a temporary wooden platform had been erected in front of the steps for the farm auction, and it was from this makeshift stage that the auctioneer's voice boomed out over the square. The crowd, a sea of straw hats and calico dresses, was the perfect audience, the perfect jury. As they reached the foot of the courthouse steps, a figure moved to block their path. He was a large man, his blue uniform stretched taut over a burgeoning belly. A silver star was pinned to his chest, but it was tarnished, as if it had absorbed the moral decay of its owner. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his upper lip, and his eyes, small and porcine, held a look of bored authority. This was Sheriff Augustus Hollander. "Hold on there," he said, his voice a lazy drawl that didn't quite conceal its underlying menace. He planted himself squarely in their path, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Courthouse is closed for Fair Day business. Judge's orders. We have business with the judge," Colt said, his voice low and even, devoid of any challenge. Hollander's eyes narrowed, taking in their simple clothes, Tamsin's bandaged hands. He was a man who measured the world in coin, and they looked to him like currency of the lowest denomination. "Official business. You got papers?" He gestured vaguely toward the saddlebags they carried. "Shipping manifests, transport dockets. What's your cargo?" A dangerous glint appeared in Colt's eyes. He gave a short, humorless laugh that was more of a bark. "Our cargo," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "is a half-dozen tanned hides and a copy of the Articles of Citizenship. I trust the judge will find them both in order." The sheriff's face darkened at the insolent reply. He took a step forward, his hand tightening on his gun. "You're a little too clever for your own good. Mister, now, you and the lady can just turn around and enjoy the fair." His threat was cut short. As he took his step, Tamsin's gaze flicked upward, over his shoulder to the second-story balcony of the mercantile building that overlooked the square. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met those of a woman standing there, a prim, neatly dressed woman with her hair in a tight bun. It was Mina Callery, the town schoolteacher, Tamsin had re-stitched the leather strap on her book satchel just last spring. Tamsin gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the signal Mina needed. With a small, theatrical cry of dismay, she lost her grip on the large wicker basket of apples she was holding. "Oh, my heavens," she exclaimed. The basket tipped over the railing and crashed onto the wooden boardwalk below with a loud, hollow thud. A torrent of shiny red apples cascaded down the courthouse steps, bouncing and rolling in every direction. A sudden, chaotic flood of crimson. The effect was instantaneous. The crowd, startled by the noise, turned as one. People gasped, laughed, and scrambled to avoid the rolling apples. A small boy yelped as one bounced off his head. Two farmers collided as they both bent to pick one up. For 5 precious, chaotic seconds, every eye, including Sheriff Hollander's, was diverted. It was all the time Tamsin needed. While Hollander was distracted, turning to curse at the disruption, Tamsin moved. She was a ghost, a whisper of movement, slipping past his side and through the heavy courthouse doors, which had been left slightly ajar. She found herself in a large, empty, and silent courtroom. The air was cool and smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, dusty scent of 1,000 forgotten arguments. Light streamed in through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. The judge's bench stood empty. The jury box was vacant. She was alone. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her riding coat tight, her fingers finding the stiff packet sewn into the hem. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She ripped the stitches with a small, sharp knife from her belt and pulled out the decoy envelope. She tossed it onto a nearby table. Then, from a deeper pocket, she pulled the real one, the one with the heavy wax seal. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The wax crumbled under her thumb. Her fingers, still clumsy from their bandages, fumbled for a moment before she pulled the contents free. There were 2 documents inside. The first was a large, folded sheet of surveyor's paper. She spread it out on the polished surface of the prosecutor's table. It was a map, meticulously hand-drawn, of the northern range of Rook County. It showed rivers, creeks, and the precise, squared-off boundaries of the ranches and homesteads. The second document was a simple ledger book. She opened it. It was a list of names, dates, and figures, and there, on the 3rd line down, was the entry that made her blood run cold. Hollander, $200. Gold. For survey attestation. He had been paid. The sheriff himself had signed off on the false maps. Paper burns easily. Miss Vale. The voice was soft, conversational, and utterly chilling. It came from the doorway. Tamsin's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Bram Kincaid stood there, a dark, elegant figure framed against the bright light of the hallway. He wore a tailored black suit and a planter's hat, his expression one of mild, almost academic curiosity. He looked as if he had just stumbled upon an interesting legal exhibit. He took a step into the room, his smile thin and cold as a razor's edge. Before Tamsin could even react, a second figure filled the doorway behind Kincaid. It was Colt. He had seen her slip inside and had followed, his hand now resting on his gun, his body a solid, immovable barrier between Kincaid and Tamsin. At that exact moment, another sound cut through the air, overriding the noise of the fair. It was the deep, resonant, and urgent tolling of the town bell, the one in the church steeple, the one used to summon the volunteer fire brigade or to call the citizens to an emergency meeting. Clang, clang, clang. It was a sound that demanded attention. From the courtroom window, Tamsin could see Mina Callery on the mercantile balcony, a tiny, determined figure, pulling on the bell rope with all her might. She was turning a distraction into an assembly. She was calling the witnesses. The bell, combined with the commotion on the steps, had its effect. The auctioneer's patter faltered and died. The fiddle music stopped. A murmur went through the crowd as they turned from the scattered apples to the courthouse. Their curiosity piqued. The door to the judge's chambers at the side of the courtroom swung open, and a man emerged. He was tall, gaunt, with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore the simple black robes of his office. This was Judge Ezekiel Rowan. "What in God's name is the meaning of this commotion?" he demanded, his voice a low, powerful baritone that was used to commanding attention. His sharp eyes took in the scene in an instant. Tamsin standing frozen by the table, Colt a silent guard in the doorway, and Bram Kincaid, a snake in a tailored suit. His gaze fell on the documents spread on the table, specifically on the broken red wax seal. His face, already grim, hardened into a mask of cold fury. He strode to the table, his robes swirling around him. He didn't need to read the documents. He recognized the seal of his own court. "Sheriff," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Hollander, flustered and red-faced, finally pushed his way into the courtroom. "Judge, I was just—" Rowan cut him off with a slice of his hand. "This evidence is now under the protection of this court," he declared, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be questioned. He looked at Tamsin. "Young woman, you will come with me." He then fixed his icy gaze on Hollander and Kincaid, "and this matter will be addressed, immediately, in public." He turned and strode back toward the front doors. "The people of Rook County have a right to see how their laws are being administered." He pushed the doors open and stepped out onto the top of the steps. Blinking in the sudden sunlight, the crowd below fell silent, their faces turned up toward him. "There will be," Judge Rowan announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "a temporary adjournment of this auction. We are convening an immediate public hearing, right here, right now." A wave of confusion and excitement rippled through the crowd. Hollander, his face now pale with sweat, rushed up behind the judge. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. There are procedures, filings to be made." His whining protest was drowned out by a shout from the crowd. It came from a grizzled old farmer standing near the front. "Let him speak," he yelled, his voice raw with a generation of frustration. The cry was taken up by others. "Yeah, let's hear it." No more back rooms. Let the people hear. The murmur had become a roar. Today the law would not be a private affair, conducted in a quiet, dusty room. Today, it would be held in the open air, under the judgment of the people it was meant to serve. Kincaid, standing calmly in the doorway, watched the scene with a detached amusement. His plan to quietly retrieve the documents had failed, so he would move to the next phase. He gave a subtle, almost invisible signal to a group of 5 burly men who had been loitering near the auction platform. His men salted into the crowd. They began to move, pushing their way through the people, their faces hard and purposeful. Their intention was clear: to take the platform, to seize control of the stage, to silence the proceedings before they could even begin. But Colt had been watching Kincaid, not the judge. He saw the signal. As the first of Kincaid's thugs put his boot on the platform steps, Colt moved to intercept him. He was not alone. From out of the crowd, 3 other men converged with him. They were farmers, big men with shoulders broadened by years of lifting hay bales and hands as tough as old leather. They had seen the injustice, they had heard the rumors, and they had recognized a moment when a stand had to be made. The confrontation was short, brutal, and decisive. There was no fancy gunplay. It was a clash of sheer physical force. Colt took the first man, using his own momentum to send him tumbling back into the crowd. The 3 farmers met the other 4 head-on. An ox-shouldered man in overalls simply picked one of the thugs up and unceremoniously dumped him off the side of the platform. The other 2 were driven back by a wall of determined, righteous muscle. The heavy wooden platform shuddered under the impact of the brief, violent struggle. The dust kicked up by their boots swirled in the sunlight. The crowd roared its approval. The stage had been secured. The auctioneer's podium, standing empty in the center of the platform, trembled slightly. The truth, it seemed, was about to be given a microphone of its own. A hush fell over the town square, a vacuum of sound that even the fiddle music and the livestock lowing did not dare penetrate. All eyes were on the small woman in the oversized wool sweater, standing on the auction platform next to the towering, white-haired judge. Tamsin Vale held the surveyor's map in one hand and the ledger in the other. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the reedy plea of a victim. It was the clear, precise, and resonant voice of a craftswoman explaining her trade. It was a voice that carried, "Mr. Kincaid," she said, her eyes finding him in the crowd where he stood by the courthouse steps, a slight, amused smile on his face. "He doesn't steal with a gun. He steals with a pen. He steals with a map." She unfurled the heavy surveyor's paper for the crowd to see, its creases sharp, the lines drawn in stark, unforgiving ink. "This," she announced, "is the map he uses, the one he attaches to his contracts." She then held up the ledger. "And this is the list of men he paid to make it." She pointed to a farmer in the front row, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry. "Abel Prescott, you signed a right-of-way contract for your south pasture, didn't you? For the railroad to cross Spring Creek?" Abel Prescott nodded, his face confused. I did. But the line they built, it came right through my barnyard. They said the contract allowed it." "It did," Tamsin said, her voice sharp with a cold anger. She traced a line on the map. "Because on this map, the map you signed, Spring Creek is gone. Instead, it is labeled Utility Channel 3. And your pasture, your barnyard, they fall within what this map calls Infrastructure Corridor B." He didn't just change the lines. He changed the names of the land itself. He turned your homes into legal technicalities. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the crowd. Men turned to their neighbors. The same dawning, horrified recognition passing between them. They had been swindled not by force, but by language. Judge Rowan, his face like carved granite, stepped forward. He held up a hand for silence. From a leather satchel, he produced his own rolled document, tied with a faded blue ribbon. "This court," he boomed, his voice silencing the square, "holds the original county survey maps, filed and sealed in 1840. He unrolled it beside Tamsin's. "Miss Vale is correct. The documents do not match. The landmarks have been illegally altered." All eyes snapped to Sheriff Hollander, who was now sweating profusely. He tugged at his collar, his face a mottled, terrified red. The tarnish on his star seemed to visibly darken. Bram Kincaid, however, merely chuckled. The sound was soft, almost pleasant, but it cut through the tension like a thrown knife. He stepped forward, ascending the platform steps as if he had been invited. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge but projecting his voice to the crowd. "This is a fascinating piece of theater, truly, a heartbroken woman, a dramatic rescue." He gestured to the documents in Tamsin's hand. "A child's drawing and a fabricated ledger. Look at the ink. It's barely dry. I'd wager the girl wrote it herself. Desperate for some attention. Perhaps angry over a land deal gone sour." He smiled. "I admire her creativity, but as evidence, it's worthless. Her signatures are amateurish fakes." Before Tamsin could even form a reply, a new voice, crisp and clear as a school bell, cut through the air. "That, Miss Kincaid, is an interesting theory." Mina Callery, the schoolteacher, stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but resolute. In her hand, she held a small, cloth-bound notebook. "As the county schoolteacher," she said, "it is my business to know penmanship. I have taught it for 20 years. She held up the ledger Tamsin had found. "I do not know whose hand this is," she said. Then she looked directly at Kincaid. "But I know whose hand it isn't. Miss Tamsin Vale helped me balance the school's donation ledger just last month." She held up her own notebook, opening it to a specific page. "This is her handwriting. This is her 7, with the crossbar. This is her G, which loops to the left." She placed her schoolbook next to Kincaid's ledger on the podium. The crowd surged forward to see. Even from a distance, the difference was undeniable. The hand in the ledger was cramped, angular, with a flamboyant, right-looping G. The hand in the schoolbook was clean, precise, and utilitarian. "They are not the same," Mina Callery declared. "Whoever faked these documents, Mr. Kincaid, it was not Tamsin Vale." A stunned silence fell. Kincaid's smile finally wavered. He had been outmaneuvered by a saddlemaker and a schoolteacher. The foundation of his lie had crumbled, and the entire edifice of his power was beginning to totter. He was a man who understood power, and he knew that when a narrative was lost, the only answer was force. He caught the eye of a wiry man in a yellow duster who stood near the edge of the platform. He gave a single, sharp nod. The reaction was instantaneous. The man in the duster was a blur of motion. He vaulted over the platform railing. A human projectile aimed at the podium. He didn't bother with Kincaid or Tamsin. He snatched the entire bundle of evidence, the original map, the fake map, the ledger, and Mina's schoolbook in one frantic grasp. The crowd screamed as he landed, spun, and bolted. His target was obvious, 100 yards away. At the end of the street sat Kincaid's personal locomotive, its steam hissing, its firebox a perfect, waiting incinerator. "Stop him!" Judge Rowan roared. But Colt was already moving. He didn't try to plow through the dense, panicked crowd. He leaped from the platform onto the raised boardwalk that ran the length of the street, his boots thundering on the wood. He was running a parallel course to the thief, his long legs eating up the ground. The man in the duster was fast, weaving through the stalls, kicking over a basket of pies. He reached the rail yard, a wide-open expanse of gravel and steel. He had a 20-yard lead. He was going to make it. Tamsin watched, her heart in her throat. She saw Colt gaining, but not fast enough. She acted on pure, honed instinct, on her belt, from her trade. She still wore a 60-foot coil of thin, strong rawhide, a saddle string, tough as wire. In one fluid motion, she ripped it free. She wasn't a roper, not in the ranching sense. She didn't have time for a wide, open loop. As the man ran, his legs pumping, Tamsin spun the coil once, twice, and threw it underhanded, as if skipping a stone. It wasn't a catch loop. It was a trip loop. The rawhide snaked out, low to the ground, and caught the man's ankles. He went down as if he'd been shot. His arms flew wide, and he hit the gravel face first with a sickening skid. The documents in his hand exploded outward. The map skidded across the ground. The ledgers burst open, and their pages the damning list of names, the crooked figures. The evidence of a decade of theft were caught by the wind. They scattered, fluttering up into the air. A sudden, chaotic blizzard of white, raining down on the tracks and the crowd. A new chaos erupted as people surged forward, not in panic, but in a desperate attempt to retrieve the evidence. Men and women scrambled, snatching the incriminating pages from the air, from the mud, from the gravel. At the station platform, Sheriff Hollander, his face a mask of desperation, saw his entire world collapsing. He pulled his pistol, not on the thief, but on the citizens. "Back," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Get back, all of you. This is official. Official. Get back." Hollander, Judge Rowan, his face purple with rage, advanced on the sheriff. "You will lower that weapon. You will lower it now, or I will have you stripped of that star before God and this entire county." The crowd didn't wait. They didn't charge the sheriff. They simply moved. A solid, implacable wall of farmers, merchants, and wives. The 3 large farmers who had secured the auction block now stood at the front. Their arms linked, they planted themselves between Hollander's wavering gun and the scattered evidence. They became a human shield for the truth. Bram Kincaid had watched it all from the auction platform. He saw the thief down. He saw the papers scattered. He saw his sheriff rendered impotent, but he also saw that the thief, in his fall, had managed to hold on to one crucial item, the original ledger book, the one with the binding, the one Tamsin had brought from Rook County. The man, clutching his bleeding face, scrambled to his feet and tossed the book to Kincaid, who was already striding toward his engine. Kincaid caught it. With a final contemptuous look at the town. He mounted the steps of his locomotive's tender and stalked into the cab. He was not retreating. He was destroying. He yanked open the heavy iron door of the firebox. A blinding, roaring blast of orange-white heat erupted from within. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the ledger into the inferno. But Tamsin had run. She had followed the man, followed Kincaid. Her mind focused on that single, damning book. She arrived at the side of the engine just as Kincaid threw. She saw the book arc toward the flames. On the tender, her eyes landed on a long, heavy iron rod, used for stoking the coals and clearing the waterspout. She grabbed it. It was immensely heavy, but her adrenaline-fueled strength was a fire of its own. As the book flew, Tamsin jammed the iron rod into the firebox opening, slamming it against the heavy door Kincaid had just opened. The rod struck the door, preventing it from staying fully open. The ledger, instead of sailing deep into the furnace, hit the inside iron lip and fell, not into the heart of the fire, but onto the red-hot grate just inside the opening. It didn't explode. It began to smoke, the cover curling and turning black, the edges of the paper browning and flaking. Colt, having seen the chase end, vaulted onto the locomotive's cab from the other side. He saw the book, smoldering on the grate, just inches from oblivion. He didn't hesitate. He ripped the thick woolen scarf from his neck, the one Marlowe had given him, and frantically wrapped it in 3 thick layers around his right hand and forearm. The crowd gasped, a single, unified sound of horror. Colt plunged his wrapped hand into the searing, shimmering heat of the firebox. He gave a muffled roar as the wool began to smoke, the smell of burnt hair and scorched cloth filling the air. His fingers clamped down on the burning, brittle spine of the book. He pulled it out, threw it onto the steel footplate of the cab, and stomped on it with his boot, crushing the flames. His scarf was blackened and smoking. The ledger was a ruined, charred thing. The cover was gone. The first dozen pages were brittle ash. But as he kicked it open, the center pages, though scorched brown and water-stained, were intact. The ink, baked by the heat, stood out in stark relief. The names, the numbers, the payments, still readable, still damning. A wave of sound rolled across the square, a deep, guttural roar of triumph. They had it. The truth had survived the fire. Bram Kincaid, his face no longer a mask of calm amusement, but a twisted, pale visage of pure reptilian rage, looked at the ruined book, at Colt, at the cheering crowd. He had lost. He lunged for the train whistle, yanking the cord with all his strength. A deafening, piercing shriek of steam blasted through the air, a sound of pure mechanical malice that drowned out the cheers. He wasn't running. He was attacking. His hand seized the massive Johnson bar, slamming it into reverse. His other hand grabbed the throttle. He was going to send his 10-ton engine backward, to plow the tender through the station platform, to crush the people, the judge, the truth, under tons of iron. The massive driving wheels groaned, then spun in reverse, spitting sparks and steam, the entire locomotive shuddering as it bit into the tracks. But Colt was still on the footplate. He didn't waste time trying to fight Kincaid. He went for the machine. He saw the brass handle of the main air brake. He threw his entire body weight onto it, slamming the valve from run all the way to emergency. The sound that followed was the scream of a dying leviathan. It was the high-pitched, agonizing shriek of metal on metal, a sound that vibrated in the teeth and bones of every person in the square. The brake shoes, with the force of 100 tons of compressed air, clamped down on the locked, spinning wheels. The locomotive bucked like a spurred horse. It skidded, its massive steel frame groaning in protest, and then stopped dead, locking in place with a final, echoing crash of metal. A vast cloud of steam and iron dust erupted from beneath the engine, enveloping the platform in a white, sulphurous fog. And then, silence. The steam cleared. The entire town stood frozen, witnesses to the battle. And in the cab of the quiet, defeated engine, Colt Mercer stood over the singed, half-burned, and undeniable truth, his chest heaving, the proof of Kincaid's empire of lies smoldering at his feet. The victory in the town square was a fragile, incandescent thing, a moment of pure communal triumph that hung in the supercharged air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. The crowd was a single entity, a roaring, jubilant beast that had found its voice. Kincaid, his face a bloodless mask of fury, was being held in the locomotive's cab by the three massive farmers, who stood guard with a quiet, immovable dignity. Sheriff Hollander, stripped of his pistol and his pride, was slumped on the station platform, a broken man being watched over by a circle of grim-faced ranchers. The scattered, precious pages of evidence were being gathered with the reverence of sacred texts, each one handed carefully to Judge Rowan, who was methodically piecing his case back together on the auctioneer's podium. It was into this scene of chaotic celebration that the bad news rode. He came from the east, a lone rider on a lathered, desperate horse. He was a young man, a telegraph boy from a neighboring town, and his face was smudged with soot, his eyes wide with the horror of what he had seen. He pushed his way through the celebrating crowd, his voice a frantic croak. "Miss Vale. Is there a Tamsin Vale here?" The crowd parted for him. Tamsin, who had been standing beside Colt near the locomotive, her hands still trembling slightly, turned toward the sound of her name. The boy saw her and stumbled forward, pulling a bundle wrapped in a saddle blanket from his pouch. "From Dry Willow," he gasped, his chest heaving. "A message from the stable master. He said to tell you, Kincaid's men." He unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a piece of wood. It was pine, scorched black around the edges, the paint blistered and peeling, but through the soot and the damage, a single, elegantly carved letter was still visible, a capital V. Tamsin stared at it. She didn't need to be told what it was. It was a fragment of her sign, the sign that had hung over her workshop door, the sign she had carved and painted herself, the one that bore her name, her life, the roar of the crowd, the cheers. The triumph had all faded away, replaced by a deafening, internal silence. She didn't cry out. She didn't gasp. A profound, shocking stillness came over her. It was as if a light inside her had been extinguished, leaving her face a beautiful, tragic mask of stone. She looked at the charred piece of wood, her entire world the smell of leather, the feel of her tools, the quiet satisfaction of a perfect seam reduced to a handful of ash and a broken letter. She had faced down Kincaid, faced down his men, survived the wilderness, and brought the truth to light. But this was a different kind of violence. This was an attack on her soul. Colt watched her, his heart aching at the sight of her utter desolation. He saw her spirit, which had burned so brightly and so fiercely, flicker and almost die. He gently took the charred piece of wood from the telegraph boy's hand. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or useless promises of vengeance. He stepped in front of Tamsin, blocking her view of the celebrating town, creating a small, private space for her in the midst of the chaos. He pressed the piece of scorched pine into her hands. Her fingers were cold, lifeless, and she didn't seem to register the touch. "We will build a new one," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of silent grief. He put his hands over hers, his warmth seeping into her cold skin, forcing her to feel the texture of the ruined wood. "It will be bigger, brighter. The letters will shine so bright they'll be able to see them from the top of the Mesa Grande." He leaned closer, his voice for her alone, "and it will have 2 names on it, not 1. Tamsin didn't respond, but a single, crystalline tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was then that the world began to change. A strange, sickly yellow light began to fall over the town square, draining the color from the calico dresses and the bright red of the prize-winning apples. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly died, and a heavy, oppressive stillness descended. Far to the west, in the direction of Crow's Mile Wash, the sky was no longer blue. It was a roiling, churning wall of reddish-brown. a monstrous advancing wave of dust that was swallowing the horizon. The red gull. An old man near the platform whispered, his voice tight with a primal fear. God have mercy, it's the red gull. Judge Rowan looked up at the apocalyptic sky. The dust storm was a force of nature that dwarfed even the day's human dramas. It was a storm that could strip paint from a wagon, suffocate livestock in the fields, and bury a homestead under 6 feet of sand. This hearing is suspended, he roared, his voice battling the rising moan of the wind. He began to gather the precious, scattered documents with a frantic urgency. The evidence will be secured in the courthouse safe. This session will reconvene tomorrow. After the storm has passed, panic began to ripple through the crowd as people scrambled to secure their wagons, gather their children, and find shelter. The festive air had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, breathless race against the approaching apocalypse. The first gust of the storm hit. A solid wall of wind and sand that stung the skin and filled the air with a choking, gritty fog. Judge Rowan, his white hair whipping around his face, turned to Colt. Kincaid and Hollander were already being hustled into the courthouse, to be held in the basement cells. Mercer the judge shouted over the wind, "You can't stay in town. Your ranch is the closest solid shelter. Get Miss Vale there. Now, she's a material witness. And by God, she is under the protection of this court. See to her safety." Colt just nodded, his hand already on Tamsin's arm. She was still in a daze, moving numbly, allowing him to lead her through the scattering crowd toward where their horses were tied. They mounted up, pulling their bandanas high over their noses and mouths, bowing their heads against the wind that was now a physical, punishing force. The ride to Silvergate Ranch was a journey through hell. The world disappeared, replaced by a suffocating, claustrophobic universe of roaring wind and stinging, red dust. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The sun was gone, blotted out by the storm, and the world was plunged into a dark, terrifying twilight. The air was so thick with dust it was like trying to breathe soil. It coated their throats, their eyes, their skin. Colt navigated by pure instinct, his knowledge of the land a compass in his mind. He kept one hand on Tamsin's horse, keeping them together, a 2-person island in the howling, red chaos. They finally stumbled into the main yard of the Silvergate Ranch, the familiar shapes of the house and barns appearing as vague, ghostly outlines in the maelstrom. The main house, with its glass windows, was no place to ride out a storm like this. Colt led them to the largest and sturdiest of the outbuildings, the main hay barn. Inside, the world changed again. The roar of the wind was muffled to a deep, resonant howl, the sound of a great beast circling the walls. The air was still thick with dust that seeped through every crack in the wood, but it was breathable, and it was blessedly still. The barn was cavernous, the hay stacked to the rafters in great, sweet-smelling mountains. A single dusty lantern, which Colt had managed to light with 3 precious matches, cast a small, flickering pool of golden light in the vast, shadowy space. He settled the horses in a stall, their sides heaving, their coats caked with a thick paste of sweat and red mud. Tamsin slid from Juniper's back, her legs unsteady. She was still clutching the charred piece of her sign, her knuckles white. She stood in the center of the barn, a lost, solitary figure in the immense, quiet dark. Colt walked over to her. He didn't try to take the piece of wood from her. He just stood in front of her, his presence a quiet, solid shield. She looked up at him, her eyes seeming huge and dark in the lantern light. The storm howled outside, a constant, threatening reminder of a world that had been turned upside down, slowly, as if moving through water. She raised her free hand. Her fingers, still wrapped in the soft deerskin he had tied, trembled slightly. She reached out and touched the second button on his dusty shirt. It was a simple horn button, worn smooth with use. She didn't try to unbutton it. She just rested her fingers there, on that small, solid point of contact, as if it were the only fixed point in a spinning universe. "Last night," she said, her voice a raw, broken whisper, almost lost in the sound of the wind. in the old mill. Last night showed me what was still possible, that there could be warmth, a beginning. She looked from the button to his eyes, and the single tear she had shed in the square was now joined by others, tracing slow, clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Tonight," she whispered, her voice catching on a sob. "What you did today. It shows me that it will stay, that it's real." The dam of her control finally broke. It was not a loud, wailing grief, but a silent, profound weeping. Her shoulders shaking with the force of it, Colt's heart broke for her. He gently took the piece of burned wood from her other hand and set it on a nearby crate. Then, he gathered her into his arms. She didn't resist. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, her hands clutching at his back. He held her, his one hand stroking her hair, the other holding her tight against him, absorbing her sorrow, shielding her from the storm both outside and within. He let her cry, murmuring quiet, soothing words that were not meant to be understood, but only to be felt. When her sobs finally subsided, she didn't pull away. She stayed there, her head resting on his chest, her breathing slowly returning to normal, in the dim, dusty light of the barn, with the world being torn apart outside. They found their own quiet center. She tilted her head back, her face streaked with tears and dust, and looked up at him. He lowered his head, and their kiss was not like the first one. That had been a kiss of discovery, of comfort. This was a kiss of profound, desperate, and absolute certainty. It was a kiss that sealed a vow, a kiss that was both a healing and a declaration. It was deep and slow, and it spoke of everything they had survived and everything they now intended to build. The camera of the mind would have pulled back, leaving the two of them as silhouettes against the lantern's glow, two figures finding a perfect, unbreakable solace in each other's arms, a small, warm heart of humanity in the vast, howling emptiness of the storm. After a long time, the wind outside began to lose its frantic, shrieking edge, its howl softening to a low, mournful moan. The storm was passing. Colt released her gently, though he kept his arm around her shoulders. He retrieved a heavy wool blanket from a nearby tack box and draped it over both of them, pulling her close to his side as they sat down on a low pile of fresh hay. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, his lips close to her hair. "We stand together, before the court, and before the rest of our lives." Tamsin leaned her head back against his shoulder and placed her hand flat on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. A small, weary, but genuine smile touched her lips. "Yes," she whispered, "and before any other storm that comes our way." As she spoke, her eyes, looking past him toward the large, open barn door, caught a flicker of movement. The dust outside was beginning to settle, the air thinning from an impenetrable fog to a hazy red mist, and through that mist, far off, near the main gate of the ranch, she saw them, pinpricks of light, at least a dozen, torches. They bobbed and weaved in the gloom, a pack of fireflies with a deadly purpose, Kincaid's men. They had used the cover of the storm. Knowing Colt and Tamsin would be here, they were launching their own form of appeal. Colt saw the look in her eyes and turned. He saw the torches. His body went rigid. The brief, precious peace was shattered. Without a word, he reached over and pinched the wick of the lantern, plunging the barn into a near-total darkness. They were on their feet, the blanket falling away. Two figures once again united not in tenderness, but in a grim, shared purpose. They were moving out of the relative safety of the barn, preparing for the second night of darkness, the second battle. Just as they reached the doorway, a brilliant, jagged fork of heat lightning, the last gasp of the dying storm, split the sky. For a single, stark, illuminating second, it lit up the entire ranch, and it showed them the enemy, No longer distant lights, but dark figures on horseback, already inside the main gate. The last flash of lightning died, plunging the world into a thick, profound darkness. The only light came from the approaching torches, a series of malevolent, dancing stars moving steadily closer. The roar of the dust storm had softened to a low, guttural moan, a sound like a wounded animal, a voice, amplified by the unnatural quiet, cut through the night. It was Hollander's, thin and reedy, trying to sound official. Colt Mercer. By the authority of the Rook County Sheriff's Office, you are ordered to surrender the woman, Tamsin Vale, and all confiscated documents. We are here to secure evidence pertaining to a public disturbance. Colt, standing in the deep shadow of the barn doorway, let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. Evidence. He murmured to Tamsin. He means to bury it. There was no time for a lengthy discussion. For a siege, they had to control the battlefield, while the riders were still fanning out in the main yard. Colt and Tamsin slipped out the back of the barn and separated, melting into the familiar darkness of the ranch. Colt moved toward the main corral. From a hook in the tack room, he took a heavy glass-paned lantern. He lit the wick, adjusted it to a bright, steady glow, and then, with a coiled rope, he hoisted it to the very top of the central gatepost, a good 50 yards from the barn. The lantern swung gently in the wind, a single, brilliant point of light in the darkness. It was a perfect target. It was a lie, a beautiful, tempting lie that would draw the eye and the first bullets. Meanwhile, Tamsin moved along the fence line of the horse pasture, a different kind of trap in her hands. She carried 3 heavy brass cowbells, their clappers muffled by her grip. She spaced them out along the top rail of the fence, tying them loosely with leather thongs. The first was near the chicken coop, the second halfway to the back gate, the third near the watering trough. They were far from where she and Colt intended to make their stand. They were a ghost army, a sound meant to misdirect, to make their 2-person defense sound like a dozen men moving in the shadows. They met again in the deep darkness between the main house and the well, a space cluttered with old wagons and farm equipment that provided a maze of solid cover. They were ready. The first shot came, as Colt had predicted, at the lantern. The crack of a rifle split the night, followed by the tinkling sound of shattering glass. The lantern exploded, plunging the yard back into absolute blackness. But the muzzle flash had told Colt everything he needed to know. The shooter was positioned behind the main water trough. A second shot came from another direction, then a third. Kincaid's men were firing blind now, spooked by the darkness, shooting at shadows. The night was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the whine of ricochets, and the angry, shouting voices of the attackers. "They're trying to pin us in the barn," Tamsin yelled to Colt over the din. One of the riders, emboldened, spurred his horse toward a side alley that ran between the barn and the blacksmith's forge. It was a flanking maneuver, an attempt to get behind them. Tamsin was ready. She was crouched behind a heavy rain barrel, her Winchester rifle resting on the rim. She didn't aim for the man. She didn't aim for the horse. She aimed for the thick, 12-inch wooden post that supported a heavy crossbeam over the alley's entrance. She took a breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The bullet struck the post with a loud, wet thwack. It didn't sever the post, but it was enough. The wood groaned, splintered, and the massive, creosote-soaked crossbeam, its support compromised, tilted and crashed down into the alley. It landed with a sound like a breaking giant, throwing up a cloud of dust and effectively sealing the passage. The rider reined his horse back so hard it almost fell, its terrified whinny lost in the chaos. The gunfire faltered for a moment, the attackers confused by the unexpected resistance and the sealed alley. In that brief lull, Tamsin heard a new sound, the soft, rhythmic clank, clank, clank of one of her cowbells, the one nearest the back gate. Someone was moving stealthily along the fence line, trying to sneak in the rear. Hollander, she breathed. It had to be. A professional gunslinger would charge the front, A coward would try the back door. "I'll handle him," she whispered to Colt. "Keep them busy here." She slipped away, a shadow moving through other shadows, her rifle in one hand, her coiled rawhide saddle string in the other. She circled behind the bunkhouse, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the packed earth. She reached the back gate and crouched behind a stack of old firewood. She could see him now, Hollander, moving in a low crouch, his pistol drawn, his face a pale, sweaty moon in the darkness. He reached the gate, his hand fumbling with the latch. Tamsin didn't make a sound. She stood up. As Hollander finally swung the gate open and took his first step into the yard, she threw the coiled rope. Her aim was perfect. The loop settled neatly over his head and shoulders, pinning his gun arm to his side. Hollander let out a surprised, pig-like squeal. Before he could react, Tamsin pulled the rope taut, yanking him off his feet. He landed hard on his back, the air rushing from his lungs in a pained whoosh. Tamsin was on him in an instant, her knee on his chest, her face inches from his. She wrenched the pistol from his nerveless grasp and tossed it aside. She took the slack from the rope and, with a series of swift, expert movements, she tied him. She didn't use a simple knot. She used a buntline hitch, a complex, non-slipping knot favored by saddlers for its unbreakable hold. The more he struggled, the tighter it would become. Her craft had become his cage. Back in the main yard, the firefight had reached a stalemate. The remaining attackers were holding their positions, unwilling to advance into the darkness against an unseen and clearly skilled defense. It was then that Bram Kincaid stepped out from behind the water trough. He held a torch high in one hand. In the other, he carried not a pistol, but a long, heavy, wicked-looking blade that gleamed in the torchlight. It was a blacksmith's quenching knife, thick-spined and razor-sharp. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the yard, the torchlight casting his long, dancing shadow against the wall of the main house. "Enough of this foolishness. Mercer," he called out, his voice calm and commanding. "This is between you and me. Let's finish it. A simple discussion between businessmen." Colt stepped out from behind the old wagon. He was holding not his rifle, but a long-handled, square-headed shovel from the forge. "We're past discussions. Kincaid," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He walked to the center of the yard, near the stone well, and stopped 20 feet from his adversary. "We end this," Colt said, his eyes locked on Kincaid's, "by standing before the people, before the law, not by lying in the dirt of my yard." Kincaid laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "The law," he sneered. "I am the law in this valley." He lunged. He moved with a surprising, predatory speed, the heavy knife slicing through the air with a vicious hiss. Colt didn't retreat. He met the charge, bringing the flat of the shovel up in a two-handed block. Clang! The sound of steel on steel rang through the night. A shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted where the knife met the shovel, illuminating their faces in a brief, hellish flash. The force of the blow shuddered up Colt's arms, but he held his ground. The fight that followed was not the elegant dance of swordsmen. It was a brutal, grunting, desperate struggle. Kincaid attacked with a relentless fury, his knife a blur of lethal motions slashing, stabbing, feinting. Colt was a whirlwind of defense, using the shovel's long handle for leverage, its wide head as a shield. He blocked, parried, and spun, the heavy tool an extension of his body. Again and again, the knife and the shovel met, each impact a clash of thunder and a shower of sparks. They were perfectly, horribly matched. Kincaid's vicious, technical skill against Colt's raw, unyielding strength. It was at that moment, as the two men were locked in their deadly dance, that a new actor entered the stage. "I believe, Mr. Kincaid," a clear voice announced, "that your version of the law has just been officially repealed." Tamsin emerged from the darkness, dragging a bound and gagged Sheriff Hollander behind her like a sack of grain. She hauled him into the torchlight for all to see. With a single, contemptuous motion, She ripped the tarnished silver star from his chest and threw it into the dirt. From the road, a new sound arose. It was the jingle of harnesses, the rumble of wagon wheels, and the low murmur of many voices. Tamsin's cowbells had not just been a decoy. The one by the watering trough, the loudest of the three, had been rung in a specific, frantic rhythm she had prearranged with Judge Rowan. It was a signal, a call to arms. A procession of lanterns and torches appeared at the main gate. It was Judge Rowan, leading a makeshift posse of at least 30 farmers and ranchers from the fair, their faces grim, their hands holding not just rifles, but pitchforks and axes. They had come to bear witness. They had come to be the jury. Kincaid saw them. He saw his sheriff, bound and defeated. He saw the ring of armed, angry citizens closing in. He saw his entire world, his empire of paper and fear, dissolving into the night. His focus, for a single, fatal second, shifted from Colt to the approaching crowd. It was the opening Colt had been waiting for. He lunged forward, not with the shovel, but with his body. He dropped the tool and slammed his hand down on Kincaid's knife wrist. He twisted, applying a brutal, bone-creaking wrist lock. Kincaid screamed in pain and rage, his fingers spasming, the heavy knife clattering to the ground. Colt didn't stop. He spun, using Kincaid's own momentum to throw him face down into the dirt. He pinned him there, his knee in the center of Kincaid's back. Rope Colt yelled. One of the farmers threw him a coiled lariat. It landed at Tamsin's feet. She picked it up, with the same sure, steady hands that had stitched the finest saddles in the valley. She bound Bram Kincaid's hands behind his back. She finished the knot, a double figure 8 bend, pulling it tight with a final, satisfying jerk. Her intricate knowledge of leatherwork had just become the instrument of justice. The crowd of farmers formed a silent, solemn circle around the well. Judge Rowan stepped into the center, his face stern and righteous in the torchlight. Beside him stood a tall, quiet man with a square jaw and cold, gray eyes, a man who had ridden with the judge from town. He wore no uniform, only a simple duster, but the twin Colt dragoon revolvers on his hips marked him as a man of serious purpose. Bram Kincaid, Augustus Hollander. Judge Rowan's voice boomed. By the authority vested in me by this county, and in the presence of these witnesses, I hereby place you both under arrest. He gestured to the quiet man. You are now in the custody of United States Marshal Dorian Pike. A low cheer went through the circle of farmers, a sound of profound, long-awaited relief that was carried away on the last of the storm's wind. As Marshal Pike hauled Kincaid to his feet, the man's composure finally broke. His face was a mask of contorted, venomous hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice a ragged shriek. "You haven't won. I'll be back. I own this valley." Marshal Pike paused and looked Kincaid squarely in the eye. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, cold, and utterly final. "If you come back, Kincaid," he said, "it will be to face a jury of your peers, and I suspect they'll be less forgiving than I am." He shoved Kincaid toward one of the wagons. The circle of farmers parted to let them pass. As the wagon rumbled away into the darkness, a single, pure ray of light sliced through the lingering red dust. The sun was rising. The first light of a new day, clear and unforgiving, streamed through the main gate of the Silver Gate Ranch. The dust, which had been a suffocating shroud of terror, now hung in the still air like a million tiny particles of gold, like the last, sacred wisps of ceremonial smoke after a long, dark night. By high noon, the makeshift auction platform in the Rook County Town Square had been transformed into the highest court in the land. The spectacle of the fair was forgotten. The prize-winning livestock were quiet in their pens. The fiddles were silent. The entire town, and what felt like the entire county, had formed a vast, silent congregation. Their faces turned toward the platform where Judge Ezekiel Rowan presided, his stern face a study in grim determination. The evidence was laid out on the auctioneer's podium for all to see: the charred, water-stained ledger, its damning figures still starkly legible. The two maps, the honest and the fraudulent, displayed side by side, and the scattered pages of Kincaid's meticulous bookkeeping, each one a testament to a small, private act of theft that had contributed to a grand conspiracy. The testimony was devastating. Marlowe Quist, the old ferryman, was the first to speak. He stood before the crowd, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a lifetime of suppressed rage. He told the story of the place name substitution clause, of how his home had been legally erased by a single, perfidious line of text. He held up his own useless deed, his gnarled hand shaking, and the crowd murmured, a low, dangerous sound like the growl of a waking animal. Mina Callery was next. She spoke with the calm, precise clarity of a schoolteacher, explaining the science of penmanship, her testimony dismantling Kincaid's lie with the cold, irrefutable logic of a geometry proof. Then came the others, one by one. Farmers and ranchers, men and women. Tamsin had only ever known as quiet, stoic neighbors. Stepped forward. Abel Prescott, his voice thick with emotion, told of how his barnyard had become an infrastructure corridor. A widow named Sarah Hemmings described how the creek where her children played had been reclassified as an auxiliary drainage basin, allowing Kincaid to divert the water and turn her flourishing farm to dust. Each story was a new nail in Kincaid's coffin, each voice a hammer blow of truth. Finally, Judge Rowan rose. He held the charred ledger in one hand and his judicial gavel in the other. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze lingering on the anxious, hopeful expressions of the people he was sworn to protect. "The law," he began, his voice ringing out across the square, "is not a weapon to be used by the powerful against the weak. It is a shield. It is a shelter. And it is the sacred duty of this court to repair that shield when it is broken." He raised his gavel high. "By the power vested in me, I hereby declare any and all contracts containing the fraudulent place name substitution clause to be null and void." He brought the gavel down with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot. A wave of gasps and then a roar of approval swept through the crowd. The original survey maps of this county are the only legal standard. Crack all property deeds will be restored to their original, rightful owners. Effective immediately. Crack. The sound of the gavel was the sound of a world being set right. The aftermath was swift and decisive. U.S. Marshal Dorian Pike, his face impassive, formally relieved Augustus Hollander of his duties, taking the man's gun belt and handing him off to two brawny deputies. Hollander, a weeping, broken man, was led away, the crowd parting for him with a cold, silent contempt. Bram Kincaid was next. He stood straight and proud, his face a mask of cold fury, as Marshal Pike cuffed his hands behind his back, as he was led toward the rail yard, toward the special prison car that had been attached to the morning train. The crowd did not part silently. They applauded. It started with a single person, then a dozen, then the entire square. It was not a sound of celebration, but of a fierce, cathartic release. The sound of a long, dark fever finally breaking. Judge Rowan then turned to Tamsin, who stood at the side of the platform, her hand resting quietly in Colt's. "Miss Vale," the judge said, his stern face softening for the first time that day, "this county owes you a debt of gratitude. And I believe it is time we started paying our debts." He cleared his throat. "The position of county saddler has been vacant for some time. We have official contracts for the sheriff's department, the mail service. It's steady work, good work. If you would have it, the position is yours." Tamsin looked at the judge, then at Colt, then out at the sea of faces looking up at her, their expressions filled with a respect and gratitude that was more valuable than any gold. The charred fragment of her old sign was a cold, heavy weight in her pocket, a reminder of all she had lost. But the judge's offer was a seed, a chance to replant, a promise of a new beginning, built not on the ashes of the past, but on a foundation of community and honor. Her eyes, which had shed tears of sorrow and rage, now filled with tears of a different kind. She could only nod, her throat too thick with emotion to speak. The weeks that followed were a blur of purposeful activity. On a small, sun-drenched plot of land on the edge of Rook County, a new building began to rise. It was built with fresh-cut pine, and the air around it was filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and the promise of a future. Colt was there every day, his sleeves rolled up, his ranch work temporarily set aside. He was not a master carpenter, but his hands were strong, and he worked with the quiet, steady determination of a man building his own home. He hammered nails, sawed planks, and helped Tamsin raise the walls of her new life. Finally, the day came when the last roof shingle was in place. All that was left was the sign. It was a single, beautiful slab of pine, sanded smooth by Tamsin's own hands. Colt had helped her carve the letters, deep and true. They had left it out in the sun for a week, and the letters had been burned a dark, rich brown by the heat. It read, simply Vale Mercer, Saddlery. They hung it together, the two of them, on a single iron bracket over the new, freshly painted door. It swung gently in the afternoon breeze, a quiet declaration of their partnership. They stood before the entrance of the finished workshop. The late afternoon sun cast their long shadows across the new wooden porch. Tamsin reached out, and her hand came to rest on the cool iron latch of the door. She looked at the shop, her shop, their shop, and then she turned her gaze to Colt. Her eyes were shining. She spoke, her voice a soft, quiet murmur, the words an echo from a different lifetime, a different world. "Get inside first," she said. "I'll lock the door." Colt looked back at her, and the smile that spread across his face was a thing of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the same man, the same lean, rugged face, but the look in his eyes was new. The caution was gone, the weary vigilance replaced by an open, unwavering love. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He stepped across the threshold, into the cool, fragrant darkness of the new workshop. Tamsin followed. The heavy pine door swung shut, and she reached for the new, well-oiled iron bolt. It slid home with a soft, satisfying click. It was not the sound of a barrier against a hostile world. It was the sound of a sanctuary being sealed, a home being made, a choice, made together, to be safe in each other's arms. The camera of the mind would linger for a moment on the new sign, swinging gently in the wind. From inside, there would come the sound of a hammer striking leather, a steady, rhythmic, and purposeful beat, and woven through it, the sound of shared, easy laughter. The door would open a crack, and Mina Callery would be standing there, a broad smile on her face, holding up a list. "My order for the new school satchels," she'd announce with a wink. "And seeing as you're official county suppliers now, I expect this time it will cost me double." And the laughter from inside would grow louder, joined by hers. Far in the distance, a train whistle would sound, a long, mournful cry across the plains. But it was not the shriek of Kincaid's engine, not a sound of greed and intimidation. It was just the 5 o'clock eastbound, a simple, steady rhythm of a world moving on, of life continuing its journey. The final shot would be inside the workshop, Tamsin and Colt framed in the light of a window, their foreheads resting against each other. Her whisper would be barely audible. "We took our revenge with justice," she would say, "and rebuilt with love," and the image would fade to black on their hands, his large and scarred, hers small and calloused, clasped tightly, unbreakable, together. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dust and the heart of the Old West. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories, 1850. Give this video a like, and if you'd really like to support us, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.